The scope was cracked, not shattered, not gone, just cracked, a single diagonal line running through the lower left quadrant of the glass, catching the moonlight like a fault in ice. Corporal Calavos pressed her cheek against the cold stock anyway. Her right arm was bound tight against her torso with a rifle sling and 3 wraps of her own belt, the shoulder joint sitting somewhere it was never designed to sit. She could feel her pulse in places she had never felt it before. Her teeth, her eye socket, the back of her kneecap. The ledge beneath her was 12 inches wide. 12 inches of granite jutting from a cliff face somewhere above 4,000 feet in the Cascade Range of Washington State. In the dark and the cold, with the temperature sitting at 11 degrees Fahrenheit and still falling. She had been up here for 6 hours. She had maybe 4 rounds left. The radio crackled. A voice, flat controlled, stripped of everything except the information it needed to carry. Voss. Dex Pruitt, not Mather. That told her something. Mather was either unconscious or unable to speak. Neither option was good. Voss, if you do not take this shot in the next 8 seconds, we are all dead. Do you understand me? All of us. 8 seconds. Cal didn't answer. She was counting. Not seconds. Heartbeats. She had learned a long time ago that seconds lie to you when you are scared. Heartbeats do not. A heartbeat is a metronome that cannot be rushed and cannot be slowed. Not truly, and if you listen to it long enough, it stops being fear and starts being math. 1, 2, 3. Through the cracked glass, through the duct-taped thermal optic she had stripped from a dead man's rifle 2 hours ago, she watched the heat signature below shift left by 4 inches. She adjusted. 4, 5. The wind off the ridge gusted once and then died completely, the way wind does sometimes in the mountains. Not a pause, but a held breath, the whole atmosphere suspending itself for reasons only the atmosphere understands. 6. She did not pull the trigger. She squeezed it, a slow, steady, continuous increase in pressure, the way you would close a door you did not want to slam. 7. The rifle fired. The recoil slammed into her left shoulder, and the world went briefly white at the edges. The sound rolled across the valley below like a single note struck on something enormous and ancient. She was already working the bolt. 72 hours earlier. The summer Calavos turned 14, her father drove her 40 minutes into the backcountry above their property in the Bitterroot Valley and parked the truck on a gravel pullout with no particular view of anything. He did not say why. He got out and she got out, and they walked another mile through pine and switchgrass to a ridge overlooking a long, open meadow running between 2 hillsides. He sat down. She sat down. For a long time, nothing happened. The wind moved through the meadow below in slow waves, bending the grass in patterns that looked almost deliberate, almost written. She watched it. He watched it. Neither of them spoke. After maybe 20 minutes, he reached over without looking at her and pressed the back of her hand flat against the ground against the grass stems. She felt them move against her fingers. Not just left or right, but in pulses, a gust, then nothing, then a gust from a slightly different direction, then a longer pause, then a thermal updraft that had nothing to do with horizontal wind at all, just heat rising from dark soil that had been absorbing sunlight all morning. He still did not say anything. What he was telling her was not about grass. It was not about wind. It was about the difference between reading a number and reading a thing, the difference between a weather meter and the earth itself. Numbers were a translation. The grass was the original language. Her father died the following January. Heart attack in the barn, 4 in the morning, no warning. She found him herself. She was still 14. The rifle in the corner of his workshop was a Remington 700 in .308, and it had been there so long it had become part of the room's architecture. She cleaned it that spring. She started shooting that summer. She got good by the following fall, and not because anyone taught her. She got good because she already knew how to read the original language. Buckley Air Force Base, Colorado. September. The tarmac shimmered in the heat. Not weather heat surface. Heat, the kind that belongs to the ground rather than the air rising in visible waves off the runway asphalt and bending the silhouettes of distant aircraft into something liquid and unreliable. For a sniper, a mirage is information. For everyone else, it is just a headache. Corporal Calavos was 23 minutes off a connecting flight from Missoula when she stepped onto the ramp with her duffel and her hard case and found herself standing in a loose formation of men who had in their various ways arrived at the same conclusion about her before she said a single word. She was 19 years old. She was 5 feet 4 inches tall. The hard case she was dragging contained a Macmillan TAC-50 anti-material rifle that weighed 26 pounds without the optic. The man closest to her was Operator Brody Kearns, known universally as Bull called that for reasons anyone who had stood next to him could determine immediately. He looked at her the way a structural engineer looks at a foundation crack, not with contempt, with professional concern. He had been doing this job for 15 years. He had deployed to 4 separate theaters. He had worked with exactly one long gun specialist under 25 years old, and that specialist had hesitated for 1 second in a stairwell in Fallujah in 2006. And because of that 1 second, a man named Eddie Cortez was buried in San Antonio instead of teaching high school history the way he had planned to. Bull Kearns did not have opinions about women in combat. He had opinions about hesitation. He leaned toward the man beside him. Dex Pruitt, the team's primary sniper, tall and lean, with the particular stillness that long-range shooters develop over years of holding perfectly still for extended periods, and said quietly what he was thinking. She's 19. Pruitt looked at Cal, looked back at the range. I know. She has never been in contact. I know that too. You want a long gun on your six that has never heard a PKM? Pruitt did not answer because there was no good answer, because Bull was not wrong, and they both knew it, and the fact that he was not wrong had nothing to do with Cal being a woman, and everything to do with Cal being a human being who had, until this moment, fired every shot she had ever fired without anyone firing back. That was a real concern. It had always been a real concern. It had cost real lives. Master Chief Declan Mather arrived 4 minutes later, walking from the direction of the operations building with a clipboard he did not appear to be reading. He was 47 years old, built like something that had been compressed under pressure over a long time, and he moved with the deliberate economy of a man who had stopped wasting energy on things that did not require it somewhere around his mid-30s. He had a scar along his jaw from an IED outside Ramadi in 2004. He had a coffee cup in his left hand. He had read Calavas's file twice on the flight out and found it simultaneously impressive and completely insufficient as a predictor of the only thing that mattered. He stopped in front of the formation. He looked at Cal the same way he looked at the other 9 operators present for approximately 2 seconds, cataloging what was there. Range is hot in 20 minutes, he said. I need everyone zeroed before the brief. He walked past. Cal picked up her hard case. The calibration range at Buckley ran to 1,000 meters with steel plate targets at 500, 750, and 1,000. The particular challenge that afternoon was a thermal updraft coming off the runway that was doing things to the air column that were not immediately obvious unless you knew what to look for. Dex Pruitt set up first. He was genuinely good, the kind of good that comes from natural aptitude, cultivated over years of deliberate practice. His first shot at 1,000 meters was 3 inches left of center. He dialed. His second shot was 4 inches right. He stared at his Kestrel wind meter. The device said the wind was blowing east at 5 miles per hour. He dialed for that. His third shot hit dirt 12 inches below the target. He said something under his breath that Cal could not hear and did not need to. She was watching the mirage. Not the flags at the target line, which were moving gently and unconvincingly to the east. Not the Kestrel, reading which was accurate, but local measuring the wind at the shooter's position, not along the bullet's entire flight path. She was watching the heat waves boiling up through her scope at the 300 and 600 meter marks, and what she saw was not a lateral push, but a vertical one. The boil was lifting, not bending. The updraft from the runway was creating a thermal column that would push a bullet high if you did not know to compensate, and no amount of windage correction would fix it, because it was not a windage problem. She settled in. The sound of the .50 caliber firing was as always a physical event as much as an acoustic one. The concussion spreading outward in a ring of disturbed dust that caused Bull Kearns, standing 6 feet behind her, to take an involuntary half-step back. 3 seconds later, they heard the clang. Center mass. She worked the bolt and fired again. Clang, and again, clang. Mather was writing something on his clipboard. He did not look up when he said, "Talk me through the correction." Cal pushed herself up from the prone and began entering data in her dope book. It is not a wind correction. Thermal updraft off the runway, heat column running from approximately 300 to 700 meters. I held under 2 MOA to compensate. She paused. The windage hold is counterproductive at this distance. The crosswind flags are showing an eddy, not a true flow. If you dial for it, you push right consistently. Mather looked at her, then at Pruitt. Pruitt was staring at his Kestrel. Is she right? Mather asked. Pruitt took a long moment. Yes, she is right. Mather wrote something on the clipboard. Good. He sounded like a man completing a satisfactory but not remarkable equipment check. He looked at Kearns. You want to revise your concern? Bull looked at Cal. Something moved behind his eyes, not wonder, not admiration. Something more careful and more honest than either of those. He was a man who updated his assessments when the data required it and the data was currently requiring it. No, Bull said. She can shoot. I never said she could not shoot. He picked up his carbine and walked back to the line. I said she has never been shot at. Mather watched him go, then he looked at Cal. Cal was already closing her dope book. She slung the 26-pound rifle over her shoulder and walked toward the shelter to wait for the brief. She did not look for a response. She did not wait to see who was watching. Mather looked at the space where she had been. He wrote one more thing on his clipboard. It said, reads environment, corrects without prompting. Unknown under fire. He underlined the last three words. The mission brief was in a windowless room that smelled of cold coffee and recycled air. Commander Aldrich delivered it with the flat efficiency of a man who managed operations from behind glass and knew it. Cascade Range, Washington State. A domestic extremist organization, well-funded, well-armed, ideologically motivated, in possession of an extensive underground facility carved into the volcanic rock of a ridge system 22 miles from the nearest road. 6 federal agents taken hostage 48 hours ago. Current status alive based on last confirmed communication. No negotiations. SEAL Team Viper was the response. Projected insertion 2 hours after dark, MH-60, Black Hawk to a Ridge LZ, then a 4-mile foot movement to the target compound. Mission duration single night. Extraction at first light or upon completion. Aldrich pointed at things on a topographic map with a laser pointer. Cal looked at the map. She looked at the elevation lines around the target compound. She looked at the ridge systems. She looked at the natural choke points, the places where a small number of people with high ground and patience could stop a larger force cold. She looked at the distance from the most obvious overwatch position to the compound perimeter and did the math in her head in 3 seconds. Someone else had done the same math. She was certain of it. She said nothing. There was no point saying it here in a brief to a commander pointing at a map. She filed it. She would look at it again from the air. The interior of an MH-60 Blackhawk smells of hydraulic fluid and aluminum and the particular fatigue that settles into gear and fabric after enough use. Not a bad smell, exactly, but an honest one. The kind that does not let you pretend about where you are and what you are about to do. Cal sat near the tail, her TAC-50 braced between her knees, muzzle pointed at the floor, the barrel too long for the cabin geometry by about 8 inches. Around her, the men of Team Viper had become what they always became before an insertion still internal sealed. Bull Kearns was running his thumb along the edge of a breaching charge in its pouch, not checking it, just touching it. Dex Pruitt had his eyes closed, doing something with his breathing that Cal recognized as a deliberate technique, not sleep. Mather sat across from her. He was looking at a laminated map sheet held at the angle of a man who had already memorized it and was just keeping his hands occupied. The crew chief held up 2 fingers. 2 minutes. Mather folded the map. He looked at Cal. When the ramp drops, you are last out. You stay on my left. You do not engage anything independently unless I am down and you have no other option. Cal pressed her PTT. Copy. This is not about your ability, Mather said. You can see things I cannot see. That is the only reason you are here. I need you behind me, not ahead of me. Copy, she said again. Mather nodded once and then looked at the floor. The helicopter banked hard left and the G-force pressed Cal into the webbing of her seat, and below the open ramp, the world was a rush of black rock and darker void. The Cascade Range at night, ancient and indifferent. The LZ was a flat shoulder of ridge 200 meters above the tree line, and the pilot's sensors read it cold. No heat signatures. The plan called for a 30-second ground contact, rotors turning, ramp down, team out, wheels up. Cal was last in the stack. Through the gap between Kearns' shoulder and the fuselage frame, she could see the ground rushing up through the open ramp. The NVG image was monochromatic and crisp, the phosphor rendering everything in shades of green and shadow. She saw it when they were still 40 feet up. It was not a body. Bodies glow on thermal, white-hot, unmistakable. This was the opposite of that. A patch of ground roughly circular 10 meters from the center of the intended touchdown point that was slightly darker than the rock around it. Not black, not obviously wrong, just different. A degree or two cooler than the surrounding surface. Disturbed earth. When soil is turned over, when it has been dug and replaced, the thermal mass changes. Compressed ground retains the day's heat. Loose fill loses it faster. The difference is subtle. Maybe 2 degrees in temperature across 2 square feet of ground. Invisible to the aircraft's forward-looking infrared sensor, which was optimized for human-sized heat sources and not calibrated for this. But Cal had spent 5 years reading 2-degree differences in temperature across 2 square feet of ground. Pilot hold. The channel went silent for a fraction of a second. Then the pilot's voice flattened, not pleased. Who is that rear element, Voss? She spoke fast. One shot at this before Mather cut her off. I have a soil anomaly at your 3 o'clock, 10 meters from center. Disturbed earth, not natural erosion. I am reading thermal differential consistent with excavation and refill. Rear element, we are reading clean, 30 seconds to wheels down. Shift the LZ, 50 meters north. Now. I need now. The helicopter lurched. Not a dramatic banking maneuver? A pilot's reflexive response to urgency in his intercom. A small instinctive correction that shifted the bird laterally while the crew chief and operators grabbed whatever was nearest. Kearns hit the bulkhead with his shoulder. The ramp geometry changed. The wheels touched down on loose rock, scree 50 meters north of the original mark. Ramp down, go. The team surged out into the cold and darkened rotor wash. Cal hit the ground last and went prone, immediately scanning sectors. The Black Hawk was airborne again in 11 seconds, its running lights already gone, the sound fading fast toward the east. Silence. The silence that mountains make when there is no wind, absolute. Enormous, the silence of old rock and cold air, and nothing moving anywhere. Mather crawled to her. He grabbed the strap of her pack and pulled her face to within 6 inches of his. His NVG lenses were twin green circles. You better be right, he said. Watch the original mark, Cal said. He looked. Nothing happened. 10 seconds passed. 15. The dust from the rotors settled in thin gray sheets across the rock. Then from the center of the original intended LZ, a single trip flare ignited, not with a bang, not with violence, just a long, hissing white light that cast the entire ridge in a dancing forensic glow. The rotor wash. Enough disturbance across the trigger wire to fire the flare. Not enough to trigger the main pressure plate beneath it. The plate was designed to respond to weight to landing skids or to 10 men stepping onto rock in a cluster. The flare burned for 4 seconds and died. In those 4 seconds, everyone on the ridge could see the mound beneath it. A curved rise of loose rock and dark soil approximately 90 centimeters across. Large enough to contain a modified 105mm artillery shell. Wired for command detonation or pressure activation. Positioned precisely at the center of the only flat ground on this ridge, wide enough for a helicopter. Someone had known they were coming. Someone had known the exact LZ. Mather stared at the dead flare. He stared at the mound. He turned and faced the ridgeline above them, the dark serration of peaks against the slightly lighter dark of the sky, and his hands tightened on his carbine until she could hear the glove leather creak. Kearns moved up beside him, voice barely a thread. Command detonated setup. They knew the LZ. They knew our approach vector. We are being watched, Mather said. Cal was already scanning the ridgeline through her monocular. 800 meters above them, maybe 1,000. The rock face was a jumble of shadow and geometry, a chaos of natural angles that the eye tried to organize into patterns that did not exist. Almost did not exist. 40 degrees above the horizon at approximately 900 meters, she saw it for less than a second. Not light, not movement. A reflection, the particular quality of reflected starlight on optical glass, a single momentary glint that was there, and then was not because whoever was holding the glass had closed the lens cover. There is a spotter on the ridge, Cal said. 9 o'clock elevation, 900. He just closed his optic. Mather did not ask her to confirm. He had stopped asking her to confirm things approximately 40 seconds ago. Move out, he said. Voss second position, behind point, eyes up. Cal fell into line. She was not in the back anymore. The movement to the target compound took 2 hours through terrain that the map had flattened into abstraction and the actual ground refused to cooperate with. Irrigation channels, crumbled rock walls, second growth timber that grabbed at gear and forced the team into single file along deer trails. The 4-mile distance on paper was closer to 6 on foot in the dark at elevation, and Cal was carrying 41 pounds of rifle optic ammunition, armor, and equipment across ground that had been deliberately left unmaintained. She kept pace. She had grown up covering 6 miles of this kind of terrain before breakfast to check fence lines in weather that made this look mild. Her lungs worked at altitude without complaint. Her feet knew how to move across loose rock without announcing themselves. What occupied her mind was not the movement, it was the geometry. She kept looking up. The canyon they were moving through was a natural funnel, high walls on both sides, a single avenue of travel, the kind of terrain that had been used to kill advancing forces for as long as advancing forces had existed. Every 50 meters, she identified a new position that someone could be using to watch them or to kill them, and then she moved on to the next 50 meters and found another one. She said it on the radio when they reached the halfway point, 3 words, nothing more, too many angles. Mather acknowledged without response. Pruitt answered instead from 40 meters ahead. We are ghosting. They do not know we are here. Cal dropped to one knee. The operator behind her bumped her boot and stopped. The column held, 600 meters up the north face in a cluster of scree, almost indistinguishable from the random debris fields surrounding it. There was a straight line, a single horizontal edge. Nature does not make horizontal edges in loose rock. That is not a preference or tendency. It is a physical law. Chaos has no ruler. Entropy produces curves and angles and tumbled randomness, not clean lines. The line she was looking at was approximately 40 centimeters long. The lower edge of a loophole, a carefully constructed gap in a stacked stone facade designed to allow a shooter inside to place rounds through a narrow aperture while presenting almost no visible profile to anyone below. Halt, she said. The column froze. Visual on a prepared position. North face elevation, 600. Below the shelf, the rock pile is artificial, facing directly down into this choke point. Mather crawled up beside her, raised his spotting scope, scanned for 30 seconds. Thermal reads cold. Thermal blanket, or he is deep in a cave system behind the loophole. We are 20 minutes behind timeline. He checked his GPS. If we do not hit the compound before 0400, we lose surprise. If we walk past it, we lose our backs. Mather looked at the dark cliff face. His jaw was tight. She could see him doing what commanders do in those moments, weighing the known risk against the unknown one, the certain cost of delay against the possible cost of movement. He was the hammer and she was telling him not to strike, and every second they spent stationary was a second they were not at the objective. He keyed his radio. Kearns, scan the ridge. Clear, boss, Kearns replied immediately from 40 meters ahead. Mather turned to Cal. We push. Keep eyes on it as long as you can. His voice left no room. That is an order. Cal swallowed what she wanted to say. Copy, she said. They moved. She walked with her body turned sideways for as long as the terrain allowed, one eye on the trail ahead, one on the dark slit in the rock face 600 meters above. She waited for the muzzle flash. She counted steps. She counted breaths. The flash did not come. 30 minutes later, the silhouette of the compound emerged from the dark at the base of the ridge. Low structures behind a perimeter wall, medieval and silent. Mather called the stack. The team transitioned without sound or ceremony. Kearns placed a breaching charge on the main gate. The lock failed. The gate swung inward. The team moved through. Clear left. Clear right. Building 1 clear. The compound was empty, not abandoned, not evacuated in any organized way. Empty the way a room is empty when the people in it have just left coats on hooks, a radio, running in the corner, a fire burned down to coals that were still warm when Bull Kearns pressed his palm over them. Empty the way a trap is empty before the mechanism fires. Cal moved through the main structure into the back room and stopped. On a low table in the corner sat a silver-colored kettle on a small brazier. She held her hand above it without touching it. The heat was immediate, not residual. Not the ghost of heat, actual current live. She tilted the kettle. Steam rose. Mather, she said. He was there in 4 seconds. He saw the steam. His face already still became something beyond still, the particular blankness of a man running calculations that are not going well. They did not leave when we were late, Cal said. They left when we stopped. On the trail, when I flagged the hide. She looked at him. The spotter was in the position I identified. He was watching the whole movement. When we halted at the choke point, he transmitted. They had 12 minutes warning before we got here. Mather looked at the steam rising from the kettle. We were never the hunters, Cal said. The sound that followed did not come from any direction. It came from everywhere. A rushing displacement of air, a brief, terrible whistle, and then the world turned white. The RPG did not sound like an explosion. It sounded like the air being slapped. A single enormous concussive impact that arrived before the sound caught up to it. The overpressure wave hitting Cal's chest and face like a flat hand swung hard and fast. The compound's south wall came apart in a lateral spray of block and timber and a quarter-century of compacted dust, and the world went white, and then gray, and then filled with the smell of burning and the high clean ring of tinnitus so loud it replaced everything else. Cal was moving before she understood that she was moving. Not toward the structure where the rest of the team was funneling through the interior doorway, toward the east wall, toward the low animal pen attached to the perimeter, a lean-to structure of corrugated tin and rough timber that angled away from the main building at 45 degrees and offered for the moment a different geometry, a different relationship to the high ground than the rest of the compound. She hit the dirt behind the tin wall and went flat. Above her, the team was calling out, "Contact high north face. Kearns is hit. Leg, he is mobile. Get inside. Get to hard cover." Green tracers came down from the ridge in long, slow arcs that looked almost gentle until they touched the ground and became a row of small craters moving at 40 feet per second. The main building's doorway was a focal point for at least 2 heavy machine guns. She counted the muzzle flashes through a gap in the tin. 2 PKMs at roughly 800 meters elevation. One position slightly higher, she could not see the muzzle flash on that one, only the impact points, which were not the erratic spray of small arms, but the deliberate spaced impacts of something heavier, working a specific zone, the north wall of the main building. She watched another round hit, then another, both hits within 18 inches of each other, horizontally advancing vertically by about 14 inches per shot. Someone up there was not suppressing. Someone up there was mapping, running a grid across the structure's north face, hunting for the soft spot, for the exact location where a large caliber armor-piercing round could punch through and keep moving. That was not PKM work. That was a precision rifle. A counter-sniper working by geometry. He knew where the team was sheltering, and he was taking apart the wall between them. She pressed her back against the tin and closed her eyes. Not from fear, to see something that was not in front of her. She was 15 years old, reloading a single-shot .22 on a cold March hillside, the sky the color of old iron, her fingers numb enough that she fumbled the cartridge twice before seating it. The groundhog she was after had gone to ground 200 meters downslope, and she had been waiting 25 minutes. Her father sat 10 feet behind her, not watching, not coaching, reading a worn paperback he had brought for exactly this kind of wait. He did not look up when she finally fired. He listened to the impact and turned a page. She opened her eyes. The tin wall jumped 3 inches from her right knee as a round passed through it. She needed elevation. She needed a different angle on the ridge. The geometry from the valley floor made the counter-sniper's loophole, a black void. She could not see into it from down here, could not get a clear shot at whoever was inside. She needed height. She keyed her PTT. "Mather, I am in the animal pen on the east wall. I have an angle on the ridge from here, but I cannot hit the counter-sniper from the valley floor. He is keyholed in the rock face. I need to go up the cliff to change my angle." A pause. In the background, she could hear the medic calling for pressure on something. She could hear Kearns saying he was fine in the particular way men say they are fine when they are not. His voice, when it came back, was changed. Still compressed, still carrying authority, but underneath both of those, there was something new. A wetness at the consonants, a slight labor at the end of each word. The sound of a chest working harder than it should. He was bleeding into somewhere he should not be bleeding into. "Voss, the cliff is exposed. You will be visible from 3 enemy positions." "I know. I need someone to pull their attention while I cross the open ground." Another pause. She heard him talking to Kearns. She could not make out the words. Then Kearns' voice, flat professional, with something underneath it that was not willingness so much as duty. The sound of a man doing the correct thing because it was the correct thing. "On your call," Mather said. Cal looked at the 50 meters of open ground between the animal pen and the cliff base. The tracers were concentrating on the main building's entrance. The rhythm of incoming fire had a pattern. Suppressive fire from adrenaline-loaded shooters runs in cycles heavy for 4 to 6 seconds, then a natural pause while the shooter's eyes reset while the barrel climbs from recoil and has to be pulled back down. She counted 2 cycles. Confirmed the interval. "Go," she said, from inside the main structure through the shattered north wall. Kearns opened up with his carbine directing fire at the PKM position closest to the cliff face. Not accurate fire, not intended to be. Intended to be loud and obvious and demanding, something that required a response. Something that pulled eyes and barrels away from the east wall. For the time it took a small woman with a very large rifle to sprint across open ground and throw herself into a crevice at the cliff base. Cal ran. Low bent at the waist, the rifle clutched at the balance point, her knees absorbing the uneven rock underfoot, eyes fixed on a dark notch at the cliff base that she had identified through the gap in the tin wall. The ground erupted 8 feet to her left, then 6 feet. She held the line. She hit the cliff base and jammed herself into the crevice with enough force to knock the wind from her, the rock face hard and cold against her back. At the base, she managed. Copy. Mather's voice, each word costing something now. Kearns took a round across the arm. He is up. Starting the ascent. The cliff was fractured volcanic basalt broken into shelves and columns that offered handholds but also leverage for rocks to shear without warning. The approach angle to the shelf she needed roughly 80 meters up and 40 meters south along the face was approximately 50 degrees steep enough to require hands, but not vertical enough for ropes, and she was carrying 41 pounds of equipment and moving in body armor in the dark. She moved. 10 meters. Hands finding cracks, boots pushing against the face, the rifle slung diagonally across her back and threatening at every step to shift her center of mass far enough to pull her off. 20 meters. The sound of the firefight below changed at elevation. It echoed differently, the reports arriving in overlapping copies of themselves from the canyon walls. 30 meters. Her hands were bleeding. She could feel the warmth of it against the cold rock, but not yet the pain. At 38 meters, the shelf gave way. She had tested it. She had put weight on the leading edge and felt it hold and then committed fully, and the inner face of the rock, the hidden interior where the fracture plane had been waiting for exactly this kind of lateral stress, let go all at once. The slab dropped away beneath her right hand, and she had half a second of pure airborne sensation before her left hand caught a protruding rib of rock by reflex, and her right boot found a crack that her body had apparently identified before her mind did. She stopped. 5 meters lower than she had been, pressed flat against the rock face. The rifle had shifted hard to the right on its sling and was pulling her shoulder backward. Below, the dislodged slab hit the scree with a sound like a rifle shot echoing through the canyon. Distinct, loud, the kind of sound that carries. The PKM on the ridge swung toward her. The supersonic crack of incoming fire arrived slightly ahead of the sound of the gun, firing at a sharp, ripping quality unlike anything else. The impacts walked across the cliff face, left of her by 30 feet, then right of her by 20. Probing. Reconnaissance by fire, the old technique of shooting into shadows to see what moves. Cal did not move. She pressed her face into the lichen-covered rock and became the rock. She willed her breathing down to nothing. She felt the trembling in her forearms from the grip required to hold position, and she locked that away in a separate part of her mind under things that do not matter right now, later when this is over. Below her, the firefight shifted. She heard Mather's voice, orchestrating something, fragments, names, sector assignments, a request for the medic. They were drawing fire deliberately, buying her the stillness she needed. She understood this without needing it confirmed. They were covering her because it was the correct tactical response, because covering the element in the best position to affect the enemy was what professionals did, and Brody Kearns with a grazed arm was still a professional. The machine gun fire moved back toward the main structure. Cal waited 8 minutes. Then she began to climb again. This time without rushing. She moved with the agonizing slowness of something that had evolved to be patient. Every handhold was tested twice. Every step was silent. She reached the shelf as the last light faded from the sky, a narrow ledge barely wide enough for a prone body hidden behind a screen of dry sage that had rooted itself into a crack in the basalt and survived at this elevation through sheer botanical stubbornness. She pulled herself over the lip and rolled onto her back and stared at the stars. She gave herself 10 seconds. Then she deployed the bipod and put her eye to the scope. The angle had changed entirely. She was no longer looking up at the enemy positions from the valley floor foreshortened and obscured. She was approximately parallel to the lower enemy tier and slightly above the fissure that had been invisible from below. From here, she could see into it, the barrel of a heavy rifle resting on a tripod extending through the loophole by approximately 18 centimeters. The heat signature of a shooter compact still disciplined behind the stock. Behind the shooter, deeper in the cave, a second heat signature holding optics. A spotter. And behind the spotter, stacked against the cave wall, glowing rectangular shapes on the thermal display. Uniform in size. Stacked with the regularity of things organized by someone who cares about inventory. Ammunition crates. Explosive cases. She counted the stacks. She estimated the volume. She thought about what was required to move that quantity of material to this elevation through this terrain and concluded it had not been moved recently. This was not a forward fighting position. This was a pre-positioned cache placed weeks or months in advance, stocked in anticipation of exactly this kind of extended engagement. This was infrastructure. She keyed her radio. Mather. Go. His voice was thinner than before. Each word measured. I have the counter sniper, 1,250 meters. There is also a spotter and a significant munitions cache behind them. Explosive ordnance, multiple crates. This is a forward supply depot. A pause longer than his pauses usually were. Can you take the shooter? She had already ranged it, already dialed the elevation. She was already reading the wind not with the kestrel meter, but with her cheek, with the fine hairs on the back of her hand where it rested on the stock. The air on this shelf was moving from the west at roughly 8 miles per hour, trying to push fine dust off the ledge in a specific direction. She watched 2 complete cycles of the thermal mirage near the cave entrance. She found the pattern. Yes, she said, take it. She waited for the wind to flatten. It flattened. She exhaled. The trigger broke. The recoil pushed her back into the sage, and the muzzle brake vented burning gas sideways, and the scope picture came back down, and she watched the trace, the barely visible disturbance in the cold air created by the bullet's passage, a thread of turbulence there for 1 second and then not. The heat signature behind the loophole stopped being organized. The spotter froze. He stared at the space where his partner had been at the sudden absence of a body that had been there a moment ago, with no framework for understanding it because the sound of the shot was still traveling across the valley and had not yet arrived. For a fraction of a second, he was just a man looking at something that made no sense. Then the sound arrived. He scrambled backward into the cave. Target down, Cal said, her voice flat. She was already adjusting to the stacked crates behind him. She dropped the partially spent magazine and seated the MK211 incendiary round carrier. 4 rounds. She put the first one through the lower left crate and walked the remaining 3 up the stack at 18-inch intervals. The results were not immediate. The cave interior on her thermal display brightened by degrees over approximately 4 seconds as the incendiary compounds began their work, and then the brightening accelerated, and then a secondary detonation sent a wave of light and pressure out through the loophole that she felt against her face and chest even at this distance, and then the display washed out entirely as the thermal signature exceeded what the optic could render. The counter-sniper's rifle fell silent. The wall banger was done. She cycled the bolt and reseated the match ammunition carrier. Below in the valley, the firefight had changed. The PKM fire had diminished from 2 guns to 1, and the remaining gun was firing in shorter bursts, not suppression rationing. She had changed the arithmetic. She was scanning the far end of the valley, past the compound toward the road access curving around the base of the south ridge when she saw the vehicle. A Toyota Land Cruiser parked behind a low stone wall, engine off, sitting with the particular stillnesses of something intentionally not moving. In the cargo bed, a vertical whip antenna, tall, thick, the kind requiring amplification equipment at its base. The base was glowing white on thermal. Hot, consistent, the heat signature of solid-state amplifiers running continuously. Someone was jamming them. She keyed her PTT. Mather, radio check on SATCOM. A long pause. We lost SATCOM 20 minutes ago. Thought it was the canyon geometry. Another pause, and when he continued, his voice had the wetness at the edges she had been monitoring. Doc is asking for the medevac frequency. He needs a 9-line. She waited. Kearns took a second hit, Mather said. Thigh, arterial involvement. We have a limited window. Cal ranged the Land Cruiser, 1,530 meters. She calculated without the computer, without the ballistic app doing the arithmetic in the same part of her mind that had always done it. Not the part that learned things, but the part that was things. Muzzle velocity, time of flight, and at this range, the drop, the wind, hold the slight correction for Coriolis. She was going to have to hold over the target using the mil-dot reticle. She was going to have to aim at a specific point in the sky above and left of the antenna housing and trust the numbers. She aimed at a star, not metaphorically, literally. She selected the leftmost star in Orion's belt, placed the center dot of her reticle on it, calculated the offset from that star to the antenna housing and mills, and held. She fired. The round traveled 1,530 meters in just under 2 seconds and struck the amplifier housing at the base of the antenna mast. On thermal, a sudden flash of electrical discharge, capacitors releasing components, shorting a brief bright bloom of electromagnetic energy going nowhere useful. The antenna listed sideways and came down across the hood of the Land Cruiser. The static in her earpiece disappeared instantly. Mather, her voice stayed flat. Your SATCOM should be up. A pause. Then in the background, Pruitt's voice on the team net. Havoc, this is Echo 1 radio check over. And a moment later, clean and immediate, the response from the Joint Operations Center. She rested her forehead against the stock. She gave herself 5 seconds. Then the first mortar round landed. It hit the cliff face 30 meters below her ledge, and to the left, and the sound of it was different from direct fire, lower, more felt than heard, a thump that traveled through the rock itself. She looked at the impact site still smoking, then at the angle, then at where her muzzle flash had been when she fired at the antenna. The one shot she had taken without a suppressor, rushing the setup, the muzzle brake throwing a visible signature sideways in the cold air. They had seen it. The second round hit 20 meters below and 30 meters to the right. Bracketing. Walking the rounds in from both sides, ranging her position before dropping the third one on the center point. She grabbed the drag handle of the TAC-50 and rolled backward off the ledge into the drainage chute behind it. The third round hit the leading edge of the shelf. The concussion was not a sound. It was a pressure event, a sudden total compression of the air against her face and chest, the atmosphere itself weaponized. She was airborne briefly. Then the rock wall of the drainage chute received her, and the impact was total, and her head hit the basalt with enough force to white out her vision completely for 2 seconds. She came back, cold rock against her cheek, the smell of pine resin and smoke, and her own blood where she had bitten through the inside of her lower lip. The rifle still attached to her by the sling. She ran her hand along the stock to the scope and pulled it to her eye. The image was wrong. A diagonal crack ran through the main lens, not a hairline, a proper fracture running from upper right to lower left through the center of the glass. The reticle visible but distorted the illuminated center dot haloed and blurred where the crack refracted the light. She took the scope off the rifle in the dark, working by feel. She could not fix a shattered optic. She could only assess whether what remained was sufficient for what was left to do. She put the stock to her shoulder and looked through the damaged glass. The center zone was degraded but present. The upper quadrants were clean. The lower left was unusable. She still had a kill zone, smaller and less certain, but there. She put the scope back on the rifle. From below and to the south, the sound of a vehicle engine. Not a fast approach, a grinding low-gear movement across rough terrain. She found it on thermal through the cracked glass. A pickup truck with a heavy weapon mount in the bed moving along the south access road toward the wadi where the team had consolidated. She recognized the weapon profile. ZPU-2. Twin-barrel anti-aircraft gun repurposed for ground fire. 14.5 millimeter rounds. A weapon designed to kill aircraft now aimed at men hiding in a drainage ditch behind packed earth. She ranged it, 2,400 meters. She said the number quietly in the empty air of the drainage chute, and it sat there with the absolute quality of a fact that did not care about her feelings regarding it. 2,400 meters, with a cracked scope, with a right shoulder she had been managing carefully, and that was now throbbing with a deep structural ache that suggested the joint was no longer where joints were supposed to be. With no ballistic computer, no spotter, no confirmed wind data from the target area, and a rifle that had been used dropped subjected to blast overpressure and scraped down a cliff face in Washington state at 2:30 in the morning. Voss, Pruitt's voice lower now than before. Doc says the situation with Kearns is critical. They need the bird 5 minutes ago. A pause. There is a technical approaching from the south. ZPU-2. If it reaches the wadi, there is nothing between it and the team. Do you have eyes on it? Yes. Can you stop it? She looked through the cracked glass at the vehicle. Moving at perhaps 25 miles per hour on rough ground, bouncing in a pattern, she could read the terrain forced it to slow at specific points, track around specific rock formations, maintain a line that was predictable in intervals, even if not continuously. She was going to have to aim at empty ground. She was going to have to shoot it where the truck would be when the bullet arrived, not where it was now. She thought of the meadow below the ridge in Montana. She thought of her hand on the grass, feeling the wind through the stems of her father's silence. That was not indifference, but instruction of all the things that lived in the gap between a number and the world the number was trying to describe. She stopped thinking. She aimed at a point in the dark above and ahead of where the truck was. She fired. The recoil coming from the wrong angle against a shoulder already compromised was total. The butt stock drove backward and upward, and the joint of her right shoulder received it with a grinding pop she felt through bone rather than heard, and then a white-hot wave of pain rolled outward from the joint in every direction simultaneously, and she collapsed sideways against the rock wall and could not for 3 full seconds produce a coherent thought. She heard the truck. She heard it for 4 seconds after the shot. The engine, the mechanical noise of tires on rock, the rattling of the mount. Then she heard the engine stop. Not stall. Stop, the abrupt mechanical silence of an engine struck by something traveling faster than comprehension. Metal finding metal at velocity. Then the grinding of a vehicle that has lost its drivetrain at speed momentum, carrying it forward without power, and then the sound of a heavy object finding the ground at an angle. It was not designed for a compression, a splintering, a silence that followed like a period at the end of a very long sentence. Pruitt's voice, far away. Target. Target destroyed. She was lying on her back in the drainage chute looking at the sky. The stars were very clear at this elevation. There were more of them than she usually remembered there being. The Milky Way crossed the sky from south to north in a broad smear that her exhausted brain kept trying to organize into something meaningful and kept failing to. Her right arm was not responding the way arms respond. She found her PT with her left hand. Effect on target, she said. Her voice sounded like someone else's coming from somewhere she was not standing. Target is destroyed, she breathed, requesting extraction. I am at the drainage chute on the east cliff, fam. I will need a hand getting down. She released the PTT. The radio slipped from her fingers. She lay there and did not think about anything for the first time in 72 hours. The stars looked like they had always looked. The cold rock pressed against her spine. From somewhere very far away, just beginning to register through the stone beneath her, the faint rhythmic vibration of approaching rotors. She had done enough to last a long time. She had not yet done enough to finish. The cold had moved past pain. That was the thing they did not tell you about extreme cold, that it had stages, and the later stages were deceptive. The first stage was discomfort. The second was pain, real and demanding, the kind that required active management. The third stage was something else entirely, a deep, vibrating numbness that felt, if you were not careful, almost like warmth. Almost like the body deciding that enough effort had been spent on the problem and some other arrangement would have to be made. Cal recognized the third stage. She had been in it for approximately 40 minutes. She was lying in the drainage chute on the east cliff face with her back against the basalt and the TAC 50 across her legs and her right arm immobilized against her torso with her own belt and the sling from her pack, the shoulder joint sitting somewhere posterior to where anatomy required it to sit. She had dealt with the dislocation the way she dealt with most things she had noted. It confirmed it was not immediately fatal and continued. The rotors she had heard were the medevac for Kearns, whose femoral situation had apparently resolved in the direction of survival, according to the fragments of radio traffic she had been catching. She heard the Black Hawk come in somewhere to the south in the Wadi, and she heard it leave, and then the frequency went quiet in the way frequencies go quiet after the immediate emergency has been addressed, and before anyone has decided what to do about the secondary ones. She was a secondary one. She was aware of this. She was also aware because awareness was part of the job that the enemy had not stopped. The PKM had gone silent after her shot on the counter-sniper, but small arms fire from the east approach had picked up in the last 20 minutes, and through the cracked scope she could see heat signatures moving along the base of the south ridge. Not the fast, aggressive movement of an assault element, but the careful, systematic movement of people who were looking for something specific. They were looking for her. 4 heat signatures moving in a loose line, 2 more hanging back at the rock wall near the road. They were carrying thermal handhelds. She could see the characteristic way people hold them, extended, slightly from the body, sweeping in arcs. At this temperature, with the ambient rock near 0 degrees Celsius, a living human body was a bright white beacon against a black background, unless you were colder than the environment. She reached down with her left hand and scooped a handful of the gray-brown slurry of snow and mud and pine debris that had collected in the low points of the basalt. It was the temperature of ice water. She began applying it, face first, then neck, then the exposed skin at her wrists and the back of her hands. Then, working awkwardly with one functional arm, she packed it over the outer surfaces of her shoulders and thighs, the large flat surfaces that radiated the most heat. She did not think about the sensation. She placed it alongside the dislocated shoulder and the cracked scope and the 4 hours of sleep she had not gotten, and she kept moving. From her pack, she extracted the space blanket she had been carrying since training, a 40-gram sheet of aluminized mylar the size of a folded napkin when compressed. She did not use it for warmth. She draped it over herself, dull side out, and packed brush and loose rock over the top until she was to a thermal sensor, an arrangement of cold debris on a cold cliff face with no particular reason to be interesting. She made herself still. The hunter-killer team moved up the slope. She heard them before she saw them, the crunch of boots on scree, the occasional scrape of a weapon against rock, the low murmur of communication she could not parse at this distance. 30 meters away, then 20, then one of them stopped. 10 feet. The scout swept his thermal handheld across the drainage chute. The Mylar did its job. He swept again. She watched the lens of the handheld pass across her position and continue past it, and she did not breathe. She was aware of the rifle across her legs and the knife on her belt, and the distance between his position and hers, and she held all of it in readiness the way you hold a door open without committing to walking through it. He reached into his coat and produced a radio handset and spoke into it quietly. Then he turned his head, looking back toward the other members of his element, presenting his profile to the gap in her brush cover. She could see the line of his jaw and the column of his throat and the specific geography of the hollow beneath the jaw. She had 3 feet of space in one functional arm. What happened next was not a decision. Her body had been trained past the point where decisions were required for this. A sequence of muscle memory laid down across 4 years of close quarters work activated in the gap between one heartbeat and the next. She came out of the brush like something that had been waiting in the earth. Her left forearm drove into his chest, pinning his weapon arm against his body. Her right hand found the knife by feel by the location she had verified 3 times since sitting down in this drainage chute, and the blade went upward into the hollow beneath his jaw, the way it had been taught to go, not a slash, not a gesture, a thrust direct, purposeful. He made a sound that she would carry with her for a long time. His eyes found hers in the dark. She had been told in training that this moment was the one that separated the people who could do this work from the people who could not. She had always assumed, with the arrogance of someone who had never been tested on this specific question, that she would be the former. She had been wrong about the nature of the test. It was not about whether you could do it. It was about what it cost. He went limp. She held him until she was certain, and then she lowered him to the ground and moved back from him and pressed her back against the rock wall. 45 seconds before his absence from the line became tactically relevant. She used 10 of them to be sick. Not dramatically. By mail, the way a body disposes of something it cannot process any other way. She turned aside and it was over quickly, and then she pressed her forearm against her mouth and breathed through her nose until the next wave did not come, and when she was certain it was not coming, she wiped her face with the back of her glove and began to work. She stripped the thermal handheld from his vest. She removed the radio battery and threw it down the ravine. She ran her hands across his kit and found the thermal optic mounted on his rifle, a Russian-made clip-on model she recognized from the intelligence briefing, with a rail interface that was not compatible with her Picatinny mount, but that was compatible with 3 wraps of duct tape and a length of paracord from her pack. She worked in the dark by feel. The alignment was approximate. The eye relief was wrong. But when she raised it and looked through the combination of cracked internal scope glass and attached external thermal, the image resolved into something usable. Not ideal. Sufficient. She put the scope back on the rifle. She transmitted blind. Voss is mobile, east cliff face, functional optic, moving south to find angle on the south approach. She did not wait for a response. The mortar team had set up on the south access road in the only flat area wide enough to emplace the base plate properly, a gravel shoulder behind a low retaining wall positioned to drop rounds into the wadi and the cliff face with a clear sky overhead. 3 men, a standard 60mm configuration. The tube was still hot on the thermal display, the base plate showing the consistent warmth of metal that had been fired repeatedly and had not yet shed the heat. They were not expecting return fire from the cliff point. They were standing with the easy posture of men who believe they have already won the relevant contest. One was smoking, another was patting the tube with a kind of proprietorial satisfaction. The third was looking down the road toward the south, probably listening for the sound of the vehicle that was no longer making any sound. Cal settled the bipod legs into a crack in the rock. She ranged the position. 840 meters. She breathed. The first shot took the man nearest the tube. She worked the bolt between the first and second shots with the fluid automaticity of a mechanism executing a function it had been designed for. The second shot took the man with the cigarette. The third man ran. She let him run. He was already past the point where he could do anything relevant to the next 10 minutes. She did not feel triumphant. There was no surplus capacity for feeling in the current situation. There was only the next thing. The next thing arrived in the form of Pruitt's voice, and the quality of it had changed from everything she had heard from him in the previous 6 hours. The competence was still there, but the certainty was gone from underneath it, the way a floor feels different when you realize the joists beneath it are compromised. Voss, I need you to listen carefully. Mather is conscious, but Doc has him on oxygen, and his pressure is not holding. The second medevac is 12 minutes out. A pause in which she could hear him deciding what to say next. We have a problem with the air support. Talk to me. The Falcon is back on station, Viper 1-1. He has eyes on the valley, but he cannot differentiate friendlies from the remaining hostile elements at this distance. We have approximately 30 armed personnel consolidated around the Wadi perimeter in the last 20 minutes. He cannot drop ordnance into a mixed position without a laser designation. What does he need? Someone needs to hold a PEQ beam on the target area long enough for him to guide in, from a position with clear line of sight to the Wadi perimeter. A pause, which means above the valley floor, which meant the cliff face, which meant her. She looked at her right arm bound to her torso. She looked at the PEQ-15 laser designator mounted on the rail of the TAC-50 operable with one hand if the rifle was braced. She looked at the geometry of the cliff face above her and identified a shelf, not the one she had been mortared off, but a lower one 30 meters up and slightly south with a sight line down into the Wadi perimeter that she had noted on the way down. Tell the pilot to stand by. She climbed. 30 meters with one arm was a different proposition than 80 meters with two, and she was not going to pretend otherwise. She used the rifle sling as a third point of contact where the terrain allowed it, looping it around protrusions to take weight off her arm when her hand needed to move. She moved slowly and correctly. She reached the shelf in 14 minutes, 11 minutes longer than she would have preferred. She settled behind a basalt column that offered partial cover and an unobstructed view of the valley below. She could see the Wadi. She could see the team's thermal signatures behind the earthen bank and surrounding them on three sides at varying distances the looser arrangement of the hostile element. Too close for ordnance to be dropped without a precise aim point, without a reference the guidance system could use to discriminate between the Earth she needed to remove from the situation and the Earth she needed to preserve. She keyed the net. Viper 1-1, this is Sierra 1, I have the visual. I am on the east cliff face elevation 400 meters above the valley floor. I am going to illuminate the center mass of the hostile element. Your target is the illuminated point and a 50-meter radius around it. The pilot's voice was precise and immediate. Sierra 1 Viper 1-1 copies. Confirm you are outside the red risk estimate distance. She was inside it by approximately 200 meters. Confirmed, she said. A 2-second pause on the pilot's end. Copy Sierra 1. I need continuous illumination from first designation to weapon impact, approximately 15 seconds. Can you hold? She thought about what 15 seconds meant. Activating the PEQ laser in an environment where multiple hostile personnel had thermal and night vision capability meant painting a line in the sky from her hand to the target, a line that anyone with the right optics could reverse trace back to the source in approximately 3 seconds. She thought about the team in the Wadi. She thought about Kearns on the first medevac with his femoral bleeding and his 15 years of doing this correctly. She thought about Mather on oxygen. She thought about the moment near the compound when the RPG had crossed the valley, the half-second when the scope picture was clear, when the shooter was in the reticle and people were in front of him, and she had made a calculation she believed was correct, and what the 1 second after that had cost. She activated the laser. The first rounds hit the cliff face 4 seconds later. Someone with NVGs had traced the beam back to its source and was engaging. The rounds came from 2 positions, simultaneously impact points, walking up the shelf from left and right. Stone fragments cut her cheek. A round went through the hem of her jacket without touching the skin beneath. She held the laser on the same point. 4 seconds. 5. A round struck the basalt column 6 inches from her face, and the stone fragment opened a cut above her eyebrow, and blood ran warm into her eye, and she blinked it clear. 8. 9. She could hear the jet now. Not see it too high and too fast, but hear it a thin descending note, like something tearing at the edge of audibility. 11. 12. Weapon away, the pilot said. She buried her face in the crook of her left arm. The GBU-38 guided itself down the line of infrared light with the precision of a machine that had no interest in anything except the mathematics of its own trajectory. It arrived before she heard it coming. The detonation was not a sound, it was a replacement of the world, a sudden substitution of all existing conditions with a single overwhelming condition that lasted for approximately 1 second and then distributed itself outward as pressure and as heat as the compressed air of a shockwave that hit the cliff face and bounced back and hit it again. The shelf bucked under her. She was airborne briefly, then she was not, and the rock was against her back and warm dust was settling over her in a fine continuous fall, and the ringing in her ears was so total it had become its own kind of silence. She lay still. She waited. She keyed the PTT. Echo element, she said. Status. Static. Echo. Steadier now steadiness coming from the absence of any remaining alternative to it. Voss. Someone talk to me. The static shifted. A sound that was not language but was human. A cough compressive and real, the sound of a chest being used as it was designed. Then Pruitt's voice. Very quiet. The quietness of someone who has just had a significant amount of air removed from their immediate vicinity and has not yet fully resolved how they feel about it. We are here, he said. 2 words. Cal pressed her hand flat on the rock beneath her. The basalt was warm from the blast, genuinely warm. She felt it against her palm. She felt the residual vibration in it, the deep structural settling of rock that had been subjected to overpressure and was redistributing the stress across its own geometry. Good copy, she said. She released the PTT. She lay there until the rotor sound came back closer now, and she made herself begin the process of becoming vertical. The second MH-60 found a flat area 200 meters south of the wadi. She walked toward it, not quickly. She had made an accounting of herself somewhere on the descent, and the accounting had returned a figure that was below the minimum acceptable threshold but above 0, and that was the number she was working with. Dex Pruitt met her 20 meters from the ramp. He looked at her the way you look at a piece of equipment that has been through conditions you can assess professionally: the makeshift sling, the blood on her face from 2 separate sources, the paracord and duct tape assembly on the scope rail, the split skin on 3 fingers of her left hand. He reached out and took the rifle from her. Not as a gesture. He took it because her hand was no longer capable of holding it with the tension required to carry it safely, and he was standing next to her, and that was the only reason. Inside the cabin, 4 operators she recognized by silhouette were strapped into the web seating, their faces covered in the gray dust of the valley floor. A 5th shape, the medic, was monitoring an IV line running under a space blanket. She found a seat and sat in it. Pruitt climbed in after her and set the TAC-50 on the deck between his boots. He looked at it for a moment. He looked at the duct tape on the scope rail. He looked at the paracord lashing the thermal optic in place. He ran his thumb along the crack in the main lens, the way you run your thumb along a thing that has been used past what you believed it was capable of. He said nothing. Neither did she. The ramp closed. The debrief room at the staging facility was not designed for comfort. It was designed for fluorescent lighting and folding tables and the particular institutional smell of facilities cleaned on a schedule that does not account for the residue of serious purposes. Commander Aldrich was already there when Cal arrived, his uniform pressed in a way that suggested he had not spent the night on a cliff face in Washington State. His file was open on the table. Cal's name was on the top sheet. Aldrich began to speak. He said something about the flight logs and the helmet camera footage and the initial statements gathered in the last 6 hours, and he was 3 sentences into whatever framework he had constructed for this conversation when the door opened. The electric wheelchair was silent except for the slight whir of its motor. Mather had removed the oxygen cannula, but the bandaging on his neck was thick and fresh, and the arm with the IV line rested on the armrest with the careful positioning of something being managed. His face was the color of old paper. His eyes were exactly what they had always been. He looked at Aldrich. "Don't," he said. Aldrich said, "Master Chief, you are not authorized to." "I know what I am," Mather said. "I know what she is. And I know what you are about to do, and I am telling you in front of her that I will put every detail of this operation in front of the Admiral's desk personally if you proceed." Aldrich looked at the file. He said with the precision of a man who has considered all available leverage, "The broken arrow call will require a review. The laser designation was conducted from inside the red risk estimate boundary, which the operator confirmed she was outside of at the time of the call. If we open a formal review of this operation, then we open it," Mather said. The operator would face a board. A silence that had weight. Cal looked at the line at the bottom of the NDA on the table. Standard non-disclosure. She had been reading it while Aldrich was speaking. It covered everything: operational details, personnel information, the attribution of specific actions within the mission record. It was a thorough document. She picked up the pen and signed it. Mather said her name. Just her name, the way you say someone's name when there is nothing else left to say. She put the pen down. "I know what I did," she said. She said it without ceremony and without an audience in mind, in the same register as a thermal differential, or a crosswind reading, or the number of seconds a held position can be sustained before the trembling becomes uncontrollable. It was a statement of physical fact that required no external confirmation. Aldrich was already drawing the file toward himself. She walked to the door. Pruitt was in the hallway. He had been standing there for an unknown amount of time. He straightened when she came out. "Buckley," he said, "the range, the thermal updraft." He paused. "You were right." She looked at him. "I have been doing this for 9 years," he said. "I have never read a thermal column off a runway like that." She could see it cost him something to say, not much. He was not a man who found honesty particularly expensive, but something. "I would have figured it out eventually." "Yes," she said, after a few more misses. He looked at her for a moment, then he stepped aside to let her pass. She had taken 3 steps down the hallway when Mather's voice came from behind her. "Cross," she stopped. The wheelchair motor had been quiet. She had not heard him follow. She turned. He was in the hallway, the IV still in his arm, the bandaging white under the fluorescent light. He looked at her for a long moment. The way he had looked at her on the tarmac at Buckley, the same 2-second inventory cataloging what was there. Only what was there had changed considerably in the intervening 72 hours. "You waited," he said. It was not a question. She had heard him ask it in the wadi through the radio, and she had not answered then, and the answer had not changed. She did not answer now. "The RP, he said. "You had the shot before it fired." The hallway was very quiet. She had thought about this moment on the descent from the cliff and on the transport, and in the 15 minutes she had been sitting in this facility waiting to be called into the debrief room. She had run the geometry of that moment many times. She had arrived at the same answer each time, that the hesitation had been correct reasoning applied to a situation in which all available options led somewhere terrible, and that the outcome had been what it had been, and that she was going to carry it regardless of whether anyone else ever knew the full accounting of it. "Go home, Cross," Mather said. She waited. "You are good at this," he said. The words came out with a flatness that had nothing to do with indifference. "That is exactly why I am telling you to stop." He looked at her with the eyes of a man who had been doing something for 23 years that he would not recommend to anyone he respected. "Go home, figure out what it costs. Before the math gets away from you and you stop being able to tell the difference between the problem and the solution." She looked at him for a long time. She thought about what she wanted to say and found that what she wanted to say and what there was to say were not the same thing, and that the distance between them was not something language could cross. She put her hand on his shoulder briefly. Not a gesture for anyone watching. Just a hand on a shoulder, the way you touch the shoulder of someone who has just told you something true, that you did not want to hear and that you are going to be carrying for a while. Then she turned and walked out of the building. The drive back to the airfield took 40 minutes through pine forest and early morning light. That was the particular quality of light in the Pacific Northwest. Just before the sun clears the ridge line, gray-gold, diffused coming from everywhere and nowhere simultaneously, the kind of light that makes everything look like it is being seen clearly for the first time. Cal sat in the back of the transport with her arm in a proper sling, the shoulder having been reduced by a flight medic, who had the professional manner of someone who had done this specific procedure enough times that the patient's reaction was no longer new information. She looked out the window at the trees. She thought about Mather's words. She thought about the moment near the compound, the half-second when the scope picture was clear and the shooter was in the reticle and people were in front of him, and she had made a calculation she believed was the right calculation. And the second that came after, when she learned what the right calculation costs. She thought about the mortar team and the scout and the drainage chute and the truck on the South Road and the laser and the bomb and all the mathematics she had done in the dark, all the physics, all the numbers that were supposed to describe the world accurately and in most cases had. She thought about the one case that had not. The trees went past. She was going home. Montana in late September does not apologize for itself. It is cold in the way that Montana is cold, not dramatically, not the cold of the cliff face, but the cold of a place that knows what it is and does not particularly require your opinion about it. The light is low and clean. The sky is larger than it has any reason to be. The grass on the hills moves in the wind in patterns that are old enough to have outlasted most of the things that have tried to read them. Cal stood on the ridge above her father's property. The valley below her was familiar in the way places are familiar after a long absence. Familiar in their shapes, but slightly changed in their proportions, as if the space had been rescaled to accommodate the fact that you are no longer the size you were when you last measured it against yourself. She sat down. She placed her hand flat on the ground. The grass moved against her fingers, not left or right, not a clean lateral push, but in the complex cycling pattern of an autumn thermal, the ground releasing the last of its warmth into the air in long, slow pulses that the grass transmitted without commentary. She closed her eyes. She felt the grass move against her palm, and she felt the cold in the earth beneath it, and she felt the particular quality of the silence that high places have, not the absence of sound, but the presence of a sound so large and so constant it becomes indistinguishable from silence, the sound of the world simply being what it is. Her father had never told her what any of it meant. He had put her hand on the ground and let the ground speak for itself. She stayed until the light changed, and the valley below filled with the long blue shadows of late afternoon, and the temperature dropped the additional 4 degrees that separated afternoon from evening at this elevation. She stayed until the last of the warmth left the earth beneath her palm. Then she stood up and looked at the valley for another moment. She did not know exactly what she was going to do next. She knew she was going to figure it out. She knew it was going to cost something. She knew she was going to pay it anyway. That was in the end the only mathematics that remained. She turned and walked back down the ridge toward the house. Behind her, the wind moved through the grass. The grass said nothing. It never had. It was just the original language speaking to whoever still knew how to listen.